All right, Eric, what can you tell me about extended distance clusters and what's the difference between them and local clusters?
Well, Bob, it helps to start off by looking at a purely traditional local cluster first. So let's start with a fairly typical drawing that we do when we're describing a local two-node active-passive cluster. Generally, when you see a cluster drawing like this, you're talking about a cluster that's sitting in the same data center, and in all likelihood, these two servers are probably sitting in the same equipment rack within that same data center. So in a typical active-passive two-node cluster, you've got an application running on one of the nodes, and it can fail over to a standby node when something goes wrong on this side. Now, what if you have these two same servers, but now they're sitting in separate data centers, maybe 50, maybe 100 kilometers apart? This is where things get a little bit interesting. You can still do all this stuff. You have your heartbeat networks between the two nodes, but you just run those heartbeat networks across your long-haul communications infrastructure, and that might be like a DWDM network, maybe it's dark fiber or something like that, but some sort of very high-speed fiber infrastructure between the two sites. For sites or for network infrastructures where you're not able to run the proprietary LT protocol over this infrastructure, you can run this as UDP if need be. So you can run LT over UDP, and that's the standard IP format packets, and those can run over that infrastructure with no problem. Now we come down to the storage. The storage opens up another can of worms in as much as in the drawing as far as we see it here, we only have one copy of the data. So what if we have another storage array that's located over at the other site? What we can do is extend the SAN fabric across that same communications infrastructure, and in doing so, we now have storage at each site, both of which are presented to both servers. So my storage at my first site is presented both to my server over here as well as my server at the remote site. The storage at the remote site is presented to the local server there, as well as the server at my first site. In doing that, we're able to create mirrored volume. So I create a data volume over here for this application, and that same volume is mirrored across the SAN infrastructure to the disk storage at the remote site. Now, there may be cases where you're not able to extend the SAN infrastructure across the long-haul communication structure. So what you do then is you set up some sort of data replication mechanism, and that gets into replicated data clusters that we'll talk about in another video. So I titled this extended distance clusters, but you'll hear different names used to describe the same sort of setup. Sometimes you'll hear campus cluster, you might hear stretched cluster, you might hear metro cluster, but they're all referring to basically the same sort of architecture.
All right. So this does a really good job of explaining the difference between what a local cluster would be right on one site and having things spread out. Exactly. So I really appreciate you taking the time and going through what the differences are.
Sure, Bob.